Hello again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Advanced PHP with MySQL course. In today's lesson, we're going to be covering the topic known as Object Constructors, which are a special type of object method. We're going to go over what actually an object constructor is. We're going to talk about how to define constructors within your class definitions. We're going to talk about how to specify arguments to constructors, and then just go over some important notes as they relate to using constructors in PHP. So basically, in object-oriented programming, a constructor is a special object method that's called every time you create a new instance of an object. So for example, if we go back to our typical person class, every time we create a new instance of our person class using this new keyword, a special object method for the person class called a constructor gets executed, and it's done so automatically by PHP. It's a special kind of method. You don't actually have to define one, but if you do, which is what we're going to go over in this course, it has to have this special name here, and that's known as constructors in PHP 5, which is the version we're working with, are known as magic methods. And basically that means they have some special meaning to PHP. In this case, it means it's something PHP knows to call automatically. And anytime you see a method with two underscores before the name of it, that's reserved as a magic method. And we'll talk more about that in a future lesson about what magic methods are. So for example, let's take a look at person.php. Basically, and we're going to go more into the details in a second, this is a object method that's a constructor for this person object. It's defined just as you would any other method, except it has to have this special name. It has to have this name, two underscores followed by the word construct, and then parentheses. And just to sort of show you that this is something inside our constructor, it doesn't do anything. It's a function that can do anything, pretty much anything other functions can do. We're just going to echo a statement that says we're inside this person constructor, so we know that this method's being executed, because we never actually call this the construct method directly. So to sort of let you know what's going on behind the scenes, we're going to demonstrate that. And all we're going to do is in this simple constructor.php script, we're going to just instantiate a new instance of this person class. Now because we've defined a constructor for it, PHP is automatically going to run that constructor every time this new keyword defines a new instance of the class. And because that constructor is going to get run, it's going to output the message. So if we actually go back, or if we go and look at this script, simple constructor.php, we can see that it outputs the message inside person constructor. So even though we never actually explicitly called, for example, person underscore construct like we would another object method, it actually gets done every time this sort of new statement is executed. So constructors can be defined just like any other object method. As we mentioned, they have to have this specific name here to be called automatically. One thing they can't do is they can't return a value. But as far as methods go, they can do the same thing pretty much as other object methods and functions can do. They can accept parameters, and they can perform operations within them. Typically, a constructor is used to perform initialization tasks that need to be done before an object is ready to use. So for example, when you have properties defined in a particular object, because that constructor gets called every time a new instance of that object is created, you can use that as an opportunity to set default values for your properties, or to maybe perform some other advanced functionality that you might need to do before a user can really use that object. So if we take a look at a new version of person.php, which again just has a first name and last name property, and here we've defined a constructor using or the constructor. It takes no arguments, and we'll talk about ones that can take arguments in a second. And basically what this object method, this constructor does is it actually initializes our first name and last name variables just so that they have default values. It's just going to initialize them to the empty string. So at least that way PHP, if someone calls new person and then tries to access these variables, it'll at least return a string, in this case the empty string, because a user of the person class will be expecting a string to be returned. If you'll notice again, as we've done in our other object methods, to access an object's properties from within an object method, which a constructor is, you use the this special variable. So if we go to our script called noArg constructor, basically what it does is it instantiates a new person class, and we don't do anything else with that person. We don't set any values, any variables, set the values of any variables or anything like that. We're not making any statements like this. All we're doing is calling is instantiating the class, and by default that's automatically going to call that default constructor. And then what we're going to do is down here we're going to try and output those variables. They're those object properties, first name and last name. Now because this constructor's been called, they actually get set with default variables empty string. So basically I just have a little test that we created down here that test if the person's object, this instance of the person object's first name is equal to null, which means it hasn't been initialized because that's the default sort of initialization value for variables in PHP, then it's going to return the value of first name. Now what it's going to do, and this is a ternary operator, and it's going to set this first name variable equal to that first name value. So in this example, first name actually has set a variable. It's set to the empty string. It's not actually a string that has anything, but it is set to a string, so it's not null, and otherwise this is going to return the string null. So when we output first name, if first name hasn't been initialized, it's going to output null. If it has been, which we know it has from our constructor, it's going to output the empty string. And we do the same thing down here for our last name. So if we actually go and load this script in our browser, noArg constructor.php, we can see that when it tried to output first name and last name, it actually output the empty string. And so that means that the values weren't equal to null. Let's say instead that in our constructor we didn't initialize, for example, the last name variable. Let's say we just remove that, so only we initialize first name. Because of that, last name is never going to be initialized. It's not going to be a string. It's going to be set equal to null. When we run our script, we're going to see last name, and it's going to output the value null. And so that shows that using a constructor to initialize variables, and pretty much that's what you're always going to want to do with your constructor. You always want to give, for various number of reasons, you want to give default values to all of an object's properties, and the place you do that, or the main place you do that, is within the constructor. And we're actually going to see a little bit more about that on our next slide. So one thing that we noted is constructors are methods in that way they can take parameters just like any other object method or functions can do. And the way you provide objects to an object's constructor is by specifying them in between the parentheses when you instantiate a new instance of the object. So we're never actually, normally when we call an object method and we wanted to pass it two parameters, we would call the object name, the method name, and then pass it the parameters. Because this is done automatically in PHP, what PHP knows to do is that if you provide any parameters between the parentheses in a statement where you're instantiating a new instance of an object, in this case the person object, whatever's in parentheses are going to be passed as parameters to that constructor object. So you can define constructors that can accept multiple parameters. They're placed in a comma delimited list, just like any arguments you would supply to any other function or object method. The only difference is just that you're not actually calling the method by its actual name, you're just using the name of the class. And PHP again knows how to automatically pass those variables onto the construct method. One thing that this is typically used for is, for example, our person object. The person object has a first name and a last name. What you can do is use a constructor and pass it that requires two parameters, And so whatever values you pass it, it can use to set as the first name and last name of that person, which is what constructors are commonly used for. So for example, if we look at our new version of person.php, we can see that we have an updated constructor that actually takes two parameters, one called first name and one called last name, and then it sets the value of our object property first name equal to whatever value was passed in via the first name parameter, and it does the same thing for our last name property. It sets the last name property of this instance that this constructor is being called for, and it sets it equal to the value that's passed into the constructor via last name. So, for example, now when we call our constructor for person, we can pass it two variables, or two parameters. We can pass it a first name and a last name, in this case Joe Smith. And now what we can do is we're going to output things the same as we did before. We're going to test if first name is equal to null, if last name property is equal to null, and if not, it's going to store in the value of first name and last name the values of those first name and last name properties respectively, and if not, it's going to return null. Now, because when you call this constructor, it's actually going to set these values for the first name and last name property. When these when this ternary operation occurs and these echo statements occur, it's actually going to output that first name and last name we provided to the constructor. So if we run this script as is, we can see that it outputs first name equals Joe, last name equals Smith. Now, in our previous version of person, we had a default constructor that just set, didn't take any parameters and just set the default values to the empty string. So in that example, if we wanted to set the values of person to first name, the first name and last name properties of that person object, we'd have to say like first name equals Joe. And we'd have to call it in a separate statement, in a separate assignment statement. So now when we go and run this version of our, actually let's do a different name, Joe Jones, so we can see that it's different. And we go back to our last script, the no-arg constructor. We can see that now it outputs Joe and Jones, but we actually had to go and use these two separate statements, these assignment statements. So what this new constructor that accepts parameters does is it allows us to, basically we can create a person and set the names of some of its properties without actually having to call separate assignment statements. So that's one of the nice things that you can use a constructor for. And then one of the key things with constructors is that if a constructor does take, for example, two parameters, so our person object in this case, the constructor takes two parameters, you have to pass it all of those parameters. So let's say we leave out one of them and we run our script, we're going to get an error from PHP saying there's a missing argument for our basically our constructor method. So basically, it's saying that you have to provide arguments or argument values for all of the parameters of a particular function. Now, as mentioned, one of the things, key thing that a constructor does is set default values for properties. In this case, our constructor requires two parameters, so our first name and last name will always get set every time that constructor is called. In our last example, where we didn't accept any parameters, let's say we actually had, this can cause problems if you don't properly initialize things. Let's say we had an array, or a new property to this person class called R1, which is going to represent an array. And let's say that in our constructor we don't initialize it. We'll go ahead and initialize first name and last name as before. And when we go ahead and run this no-arg script, it's going to run, well, let's get rid of these. It's going to run fine. And it works as functions. However, Now, because users of our person class will know that it contains an array as one of its properties, maybe they will try to access that array. For example, maybe they'll run a test that tests for a particular value in that array. So for example, they'll call on the person object, they'll access that property, R1, and they're going to say, using the inArray function, for example, is the string 1 within that person, that array property of the person object. Now, because that hasn't been initialized, this is going to cause an error. So if we actually go ahead and try to load this now, we're going to say, warning, inArray expects parameter 2 to be an array. So these are some of the problems this is an example of some of the problems that can come up when you don't initialize the properties of your class. So the way you would handle this would be to go ahead in our person class, in the constructor, which is the place to do this, is we could say R1 equals empty array. So now it's definitely an array. It's an empty array, but at least it won't cause problems when people try to access it, or other code tries to access it as an array. Now when we run our script, it's not going to throw any problems because it's actually an array data type. So a couple of things to note is, as you've seen in our web application example, a class is not required to have a constructor method. We haven't actually had that in our, for example, our item and our department objects within our web application. However, if it is provided, PHP will automatically run it for you. As mentioned again, it's good practice to make sure all of an object's properties are initialized, and you can do that in the constructor method. And then one thing to note for those of you that have used other programming languages is, unlike other programming languages, in PHP you can only have one constructor defined per class. A lot of other languages allow what's known as constructor overloading, where you can have different constructors for an object that take different parameters, and depending on how many parameters you pass to, for example, you pass to you put in parentheses when you're declaring a new instance of an object. PHP or the other programming languages will call different constructors based on how many variables or parameters are provided. So you actually could maybe have two constructors. Maybe one of them takes one parameter, one of them takes two. Well, in PHP, that's not allowed. So for those of you that are familiar with that in other languages, that's not something that you can do in PHP. So for the homework challenge, basically what I'm going to have you do is update something that you did in our last homework, which is update our HTTP request class. First thing I'm going to have you do is create a new property for the class called method. And method is basically going to be an integer that can have a value of 0 or 1 to represent whether this HTTP request is a GET request or a POST request. If the value is 0, it's a GET request. If a value is 1, it's a POST request. Then what I want you to do is alter the GET request method so that when it outputs that first line of the HTTP request, for example, get/index.html http/1.1, it's going to test the value of this method property, and if it's a 0, it's going to use the get method. It's going to output get/index.html. If it's a 1, it's going to use the post method. It's going to say post/index.html. So update get request method. Then I want you to add a constructor, and that's what we're going to take from this lesson today, that takes two parameters. The first one's going to be the URI property. So as you remember from our HTTP request class that we designed that you were to design in the last homework, the HTTP request object has a URI property that represents the URI for this HTTP request. So you're going to pass in a string. The constructor is going to take a string that's going to set the URI property. It's also going to take an integer, a 0 or 1, that's going to allow you to set the method property. So when we create this HTTP request, we can set its method and its URI all by calling the constructor. Make sure also that your constructor initializes the headers property. Probably going to want to do it to an empty array, because headers, as you remember, is an array. That's what we're using it as within our HTTP request class. So, and the constructor is a place where we initialize object variables. So we're going to give it the default value typically of an empty array. So make sure you do that for headers. And then I want you to go ahead and create an instance of this new updated HTTP class where you supply it both some random URI like /index.html and then a 1 for the method property, a 1 that's going to set the method property of the post method. Go ahead and add a host header to the object using our add header method, and then call getRequest on that object and output its output between pre-tags. And then verify that your output has the format here. If it's implemented correctly, you should see that post is output as the method of this request because we've passed it a 1 when we created the instance, and also that it has a host header on it as well, and the value of that can be whatever you pass it to, but the main portion for this lesson is about the post. Then what I want you to do is alter the constructor so that if a value provided for method, because it's a parameter required for that constructor, I can provide a method with a value that's a string A. Well, that's not a 0 or 1, so that's not useful to us. So in the constructor, if the value provided that's for the method property is not a 0 or 1, then it's going to default and set the value method equal to 1, which is by default, in this case, the default would be the get method. So this is an example of how you can also use your constructor to make sure that your objects start off in a well-known state. You can sort of perform some error checking. So instead of being able to set, all of your functions, for example, in your HTTP request object are going to be expecting a 0 or a 1 as the value for method. Well, by using the constructor to ensure that method only gets set to a 0 or a 1, you're going to make sure that those other functions are going to work as expected. Then, to test out that this new constructor that test method to make sure it's a valid value works, go ahead and create another instance of the class, but this time providing the integer 5 as the method argument. And then verify that now when you output the request using the getRequest method, that it actually has the get method listed in the request. And that's because your constructor should, by default, if a 0 or 1 is not provided, it's going to default method to 0, which corresponds to the get method. So that ends today's lesson. Thank you for watching educator.com, and look forward to seeing you next time.